Okay, welcome back. Again, we're a few minutes late, but we'll catch up. We'll speed up along the way. Our next speaker is Georg Schöllhammer, and he's an old friend of Istanbul, having been involved with Retreat as well as the Sweet 60s project that Depo is co-organizing. Georg is a writer, editor, and curator based in Vienna. He's the founder of the journal Springerin, and he's the head of tranzit.at and the chairman of the Jewish Scholar Society, Bratislava. Being editor-in-chief of Documenta 12 in Kassel, Georg has conceived and directed Documenta 12 magazines. He has also curated Manifesta 8 in 2010 and directed the last edition of the Vienna Art Fair in 2011. And he's a member of the boards of Contact, the art collection of the Erste Group, and Stahischer Herbst. And his forthcoming, as well as recent exhibitions and projects include Imagination of the Political Subject at the Vienna Festival in 2013, Soviet Modern in Vienna in 2012, Moments at ZKM in 2012, Sweet 60s is an ongoing project, and so on and so forth. There's a lot to say about Georg. Okay, thank you, Georg. You have the floor.
Come on, Rafi. Thanks. I hope I have a lot to say because of actually a lot has been said about that. What I wanted to talk. Stenka has talked about her perspective on that. What one usually calls, in a general subject, the former East or Eastern Europe. And she has already somehow challenged that notion, and that, so to say, her heuristic power that this subcontinent of Europe that one could call the post-socialist or post-Soviet or post-communist continent as well. And on the other hand, Stephen just actually touched a lot of things that I would have touched in my paper. So it's maybe even a benefit for here that I lost my paper and my data stick, and I could not print it out, and I have to extemporate a bit on things. I have to apologize for the very raw quality of the imagery that I'm going to show today. The better quality, as I said, has been drowned, left on a wherever security board, very likely of an airport that enables us to travel into all these regional specificities and to talk about a strange thing like collecting. I come actually from a country that has somehow, in its imperial fantasies, a quite big history of collecting, because it is the country where the first, so to say, idea of that, what a modern collecting could be, has developed in the 16th century around the Kunst- und Wunderkammern that the Habsburgians had, where the Habsburgians had collected in, so to say, the knowledges of not just the sciences and that what one could call the new canons of science of the Renaissance, but as well the colonial treasures, so to say, that have been collected not singularly by them, but around in the globe. So the Habsburg Kunst- und Wunderkammern have been maybe partly a model of that, what we have been talking about collecting, where a lot of art historical reflection around collecting is still circulating around. But nevertheless, this country then shrinked and had two traumas, the trauma, so to say, of getting very small, and the other trauma after the First World War, and the other trauma of, so to say, seeing a void of contemporary practices due to its engagement in Austrofascism and then in the Nazi fascism. So it was the country partly where the negative of that, what we would call a modern art collection, has been conceived in its head, namely the Deutsche Kunstausstellung of 1937. And the positive, so to say, example of what had, so to say, to be brought out of the narratives of a nationalist and fascist ideology that is structurally and in its use of the power of aesthetics had a lot of similarities to the Stalin Soviet Union of that period. So what we saw when actually elsewhere, especially in the United States, but as well departing from the 1950s and 60s in France, and then in Great Britain with so to say the big museums that then already started, and in the Western world we saw something like a deep void. A lot of the artists actually emigrated, had to emigrate or converted, and there was something like a break of around, one would say, 20 years of absence of contemporary practices that would have been collected. And in the 50s, 40s and 50s, the state really still was very reluctant to cope up with that. So the state engaged more or less in a moderate post-Cézannist realistic modernism that he collected into museums till the late 50s, when a guy called Werner Hoffmann, a then famous art historian and museums director, took over a project that set Austria, after it was, so to say, free again in 56, to the universalist agenda again. Namely with a museum that was meant to be a museum of contemporary art, but was called a museum of the 20th century, which had some consequences. It was the high times of modernism when it started, and Hoffmann not just collected, Hoffmann made 2 or 3 decisions. There has not been something like a museum's pavilion or an architecture. So what he did was he took the Austrian pavilion from the Brussels World Exhibition to be the container of a museum of contemporary art. It was a container that was actually designed to work for a trade show, namely the Austrian trade show and culture show at the Brussels World Exhibition, and that had something like an impossibility of displaying that then practices of contemporary art, which have been very much small format painting. There was an arrival of late abstractionism. There was small avant-gardes that collected around more or less that what the Americans had brought with their American exhibition to Vienna in the 1950s as well, namely abstract expressionism and all that what one could call the Greenbergian legacy. So Hoffmann started with that, and he started with a universalist approach. Namely, he started to collect the century in a way. He bought Gemini missiles, capsules, Gemini capsules. He bought in computer technology, early computing technology. He tried to really make the type of a universalist panorama, and he relatively early bought in art that was not canonized, not just from Austria, but from the wider region, one could even say the world. But that directorship stopped, and then nothing was left throughout the 60s, and the Austrian avant-garde that somehow had developed their strategies came out of the cages of the small bars of the existentialist, so to say, circles, and had a big explosion against the, one could say, the therapeutical explosion against both, namely the diktat of abstract expressionism and painting as and sculpture as the role model, so to say, for a modernist, universalist, modernist practice. And on the other hand, they had to get rid of the suppression strategies of, on the one hand, the Catholic Church that still was very important in the countryside, and in the social democratic reign of suppressing collective, so to say, talk about that what had happened in the Nazi period. This was Viennese expressionism, which was Viennese actionism. So there was no way for developing something like an influence in the 70s of 60s and 70s of that what elsewhere in the world had been, so to say, the reigning paradigm, that what one calls now conceptualism, or say it with a more modern term, local conceptualism, global conceptualism. So that arrival of anti-modernist, so to say, idea in the high times of the late high times of universalist modernism in the early 60s, with fluxes from the Iranian region and with the American conceptual paradigm. This did not arrive in Austria at all. So we have been missing this, and there was no collection. The museum just collected locally. The Hoffman thing was over, and the museums collected locally until this lack suddenly got visible because of the museum could no longer compete with the German museums. They saw it, so to say, in all of their exchange things. And a German got director of a new museum, and the Social Democrat minister had the idea how to fill that gap. And the gap was filled, and this is a theme somehow that is ongoing in Viennese contemporary collecting landscape, by a private collection. It was the famous collection of Ludwig, the chocolate baron, as Hans Hake once had called him, that very early actually started to take over that what Harald Seemann had proposed at Documento 72, namely to look at not just practices, so to say, around, like in the local vicinities or European practices, but to start a dialogue with the American with the American paradigm that was then already gaining canonical powers. So we have a Ludwig collection, and this collection has one in the center, a collection of an artist. The Ludwig collection is very much a pop art, nouveau realisme, and American type of photographic realistic painting, and it is totally strange to that what the Viennese art world has been practicing then. But there was one thing, which was the Maus Museum by Claes Oldenburg, which itself is a collection in a collection, because it was that what Claes Oldenburg had collected after the famous saying of the Smithsons in the 70s, in the 60s, from now on we collect ads. He just did it, so to say, in the world of objects. He collected, so to say, that what the everyday taste of or the everyday surrounding of the American petite bourgeoisie that then was developing, was in the middle of a strong media industry that Adorno had analyzed as writing the history of the current in the 70s. So there was, in the center, there was this. That's what we lived with. Okay, 89, you have touched it. 89 brought a lot of things in. And Austria, again, I would say, reacted lately. It was Stenker that somehow then already in the early 90s started to collect when she got a director. But the Austrians have much more been intrigued, and even the Austrian artists, by the new paradigm that had come up by post-punk and electronic fantasies of the new wave, and so to say the idea of the Iraq War, the first Iraq War, with its missiles that would hit. Now we know that it's a fake, and the idea of the internet, and the idea of something like a neo-geometrical order that would have come from so to say, from abstraction of that what electronics mean, and the early electronic production of surfaces then developed in the artistic scenes, and that they have been very, very engaged in a west-eastern discourse somewhere at the end of the continent, and nobody saw what was happening elsewhere. What a universalist criticism meant elsewhere. Namely, for instance, just 60 kilometers away from Austria in Bratislava, where an artist like Julius Koller, this is his famous ping pong monument that he had proposed at the competition for a public monument at the occasion of the building of that neighborhood in Bratislava in the 80s. There was really an artist competition, and he said, I want to build this monument. Maybe a late reflexus to Oldenburg, as one could read it in a Western history, but coming from totally different paradigms, namely telling a story of counterproduction against the normativity of the leading years in the system of the socialist revanchism after '68 in Prague, where more or less the '56 opening has been closed again, especially in Prague. It was a call for justice, a call for to say, be a sportsman, act to us like justice. It was not something like a pop art monument, but these artists have been totally blinded out of the Austrian collecting scene, and have been blinded out of the collecting scene of their localities as well. So what they did, well, this was from my other lecture. What they did, they reacted on it. Like, for instance, people in Yugoslavia reacted on that being dominated by that what collections, especially then museums collection in the West-West discourse and then the canons that had built up in between Holland, the Netherlands, Belgium, partly for sure Great Britain and especially Germany, and then the American academia, that had its reason in another, so to say, transformation of a private collection. That was namely that where the paradigm of contemporary art started in the United States. It started with a small private collection of Cubist, proto-Cubist, late Impressionist art in a small salon, 1913, the Salon des Fleurs of Gertrude Stein and her female friend. It was a Yugoslav artist that still then actually has had the first, so to say, created the first counter narrative of a collection against the domination of this arrival of an European paradigm that then was taken over by Alfred Barr and commodified and canonized in the Museum of Modern Art in the 1930s and 40s, where partly in Europe modernity did not exist at all, where Europe's so to say, building industry and most of the painters have been much more in favor of a neoclassicist, nationalist or proto-fascist romantics, and contemporary practices have been suppressed in a lot of respects. You know that even that from France you could even see it in Spain and elsewhere. And Barr had made it. What Goran Đorđević, this artist, then did, he followed the traces of, so to say, this transfer of an artistic collection and its paradigms to the canon making in the American, so to say, museum world, and especially in Alfred Barr, and he reconstructed, like an ethnographer, the Salon des Fleurs in a small flat at Spring Street 2 in New York, at Spring Street 11 in New York, just around the corner of Dan Graham. So it was, so to say, a mirror, and it was not by chance. It happened that he really got this flat in the corner of Dan Graham. So it was mirroring, so to say, the legacy back and exoticizing the American treasuries that have been that have been brought there. This is Goran Djordjevic, one of the representations of the Salon de Fleurs. Again in Stockholm, I think this was in the early 90s. He repainted all these things, and who had ever the chance to, for instance, see his cabinet in the SANAT Museum has an idea what this means, this transposition, this copying, this recopying, this following the traces of a narrative that had departed and then strangely made powerful canons against the ones that have been, so to say, almost writing it or excluding it. So Koller made his small and fine and nice and hidden actions in the 80s, and it appeared in the visibility of a generation of artists. Roman Ondak, Boris Ondrejka, again in the mid-90s. They suddenly, it was the artists, it was not the museum people, they excavated, so to say, these Oldenburg-like museums that have been collected in the private flats of a lot of Eastern European artists, and found ways to debate them that not have been just following that what usually happens or what often happens, namely for debate them as a mere mirror or as a mere reflection or as a dissident practice that would have reflected the Western canons. The Julius Koller Society I'm representing here is maybe part of that initiative. We have collected, so to say, the heritage of Koller, who as such, that as such is something like an album, one could say, a commented album of the paramodernisms that had developed in especially in the Czechoslovak realm from the 70s to the 80s, where he commented on, so to say, the two totalities of the systems, the totality of the system of representation that the state somehow had empowered, and on the other hand, on the negative totality of the being trapped into, so to say, a dialogue with Western avant-garde that because of one could not develop its own terminology and had to paraphrase the terminologies to see how the practice would fit in. But one was very aware of that the practice was a totally different practice. So what we see developing there, for instance, is a totally different landscape of otherness. That's another of these artists' museums that one can find. It's the Museum of Stano Filko in Bratislava, 200 square meter house full of objectivized, so to say, remainders of object-based, comparable, one could say, to Nouveau Realisme practice that had been had developed in the Czech Republic in the late 60s. So another color painting excavated out of that, or the library and the archives of Filko. So, and the system, so to say, the system of the archive itself. So you see artistic practices of structuring a collection in a totally non-instrumentalized way, of finding ways to bring objects to speak that is embedded in parasystems, in alternative modalities that point out of the canon making initiatives of the museums and the private collections. So this is what we found, and the artists in that period found and worked with. Another example is Mladen Stilinovic, a museum of Mladen Stilinovic that he did in his own flats in Zagreb, Croatia. So you find a lot of these types of already aggregated collections that in themselves refer much more that what we nowadays are getting again so interested in, namely the field of artistic research. I think there is a strange counterbalance in between the upcoming of a very monetarized system of collecting that is objectivizing, that is, so to say, following certain paths where certain societal milieus that are globalized, you described it quite well, Stephen, are now exchanging their, so to say, cultural values via collecting in contemporary art, mainly in major pieces that have made it on the market. And on the other hand, this huge interest of the art institutions and the education institution in overriding, so to say, that massive objectivation of artworks in collections by bringing in different forms of knowledges and by developing these strange programs of artistic research that you already find somehow embedded in that. One could ask for another example of a small collection of objects that have been found in the Polish Academy and then rearranged to a cultural arrangement in 1972 by Sophia Kulik and Pavel Kwiek, a practice that is to be really thought of after, and an archive and a collection again that has been formed by an artistic couple in the Eastern European realm in a villa near Warsaw, that itself in its taxonomy and in the way it does not make a difference between that what an archive is, that what an object is, that what an object to be displayed is maybe a role model for further collectings, but what we are seeing at the moment is something different. Namely, look at 1997, how similar. It is the Generali Foundation in Vienna. The Generali Foundation, let me go back to the Austrian history. The Generali Foundation filled up that gap that I had described from its foundation in 1992, that I had described, that was existing, so to say, in the Austrian museum landscapes. We had this ruin of the Universalist model Museum of Hoffmann. We had a Museum of Modern Art that started already to collect, so to say, the heroes of the cafes, namely namely the Viennese actionism, but we had a lack of consideration, so to say, of that, what's the other canon that was imposed to us, on the other hand, that had enabled a young generation of the early 1990s and late 80s to think back about the political capacities of art of the late 80s and of the 60s to reconsider their locality in Austria. So we saw a generation that now is quite famous, from Florian Baumösel to Helmut Sobernik, develop their practices around a void that was somehow existing as well in the system of teaching and in the museums, where abstract expressionism, 50s, 60s, local modernity had been collected in, and Viennese actionism has been made something like a world phenomenon of specific performative practice. But there was a lack, so to say, of related material to a practice that wanted to see itself, so to say, rewrite itself in a global idea of a political that was critical to the representational systems of art, that was critical somehow to the institution, and that was critical to that what happened in Austria. And that's how they started to collect. Sabine Breit-Wieser, the then director of this collection, got the offer from an insurance company which with a director that has collected more or less quality of abstract expressionist painting and late modernist objects to develop a collection of sculptures for them. And departing from that, collecting, so to say, the 1980s post-conceptual sculpture that was very, very fashionable in Austria then, and starting from a local conception, she got very early in dialogue with this young artist scene that actually found out that there was a void of usable material that was not even canonized elsewhere. If you think about that, what happened to that, where the collection then developed to be one of the world's, well, I think most centered and specific collections of that what one could call the Western conceptual, politicized paradigm of the 1960s and 70s. It was not collected in the American museums as well. There have not been so many big shows. So she had a good chance to, so to say, counteract the wrong canonization or the post-Greenbergian legacy in the American museums. There have been just a few. The MoCA did a show in, I think it was in the early 90s, where they had a conceptualism show, but as somehow what has been found in the artists' archives of Eastern Europe and not been visible in Austria then, she found a lot of still existing material and concepts in the artists' flats and collected this into her collection. Yeah? And made this collection over the years. In 1997, they built a pretty modernist structure, this empty space into an old, actually, warehouse. What she made was, she developed something like a proto-museum. The museums have been somehow dead and started already then in the late 90s their policy of blockbuster shows, and she found a way to find a structure with a separate structure out of the company that allowed her certain freedom to develop with this young artist generation and more internationally an archive of their own practices, one could say, an archive of their own interests, much more than a collection of complex contemporary art. And I think this is a very important point, that this was an interest-driven, so to say, an artist-driven impetus that formed that collection, and that's why they immediately started not just to collect and display, but to research and collect contextual material, which mirrors in their library that they built up, which is open to the public, and in their media space where they have a collection of documentary stuff and video. So after the years, for sure, this got again a canonical institution because they published a lot of first monographies. They had done a lot of research, and it's a strange term that avoids in Austria and an old legacy of a paradigm in the American museums world, so to say, creates a space with the help of a private investor where you can create a collection of American art, conceptual art or Western conceptual art in such a small, fill up a void and, so to say, harvest from a structure of hegemony. And that's what she more or less did in Generali Foundation. Now it is seen as one of the, it's still in danger because of it is a private institution, and if the private funders withdraw, all that built almost artistically, like with a lot of personal power and exclusion fantasies, she created her own museum of a practice where she had departed from and made this an international venue. Here you see an exhibition of Dorit Margreiter where she uses part of the collection, for instance, the semi-transparent mirror system and wall system by Dan Graham. Well, Contact, another work by Julius Koller, who did a lot of print works from the late 50s on. This is 69, as you see, and it's what Contact means here is not just that it means please get in touch with us, like the dissident call, but it means somehow encounter, create something like inner artistic spaces. I invite you to join my archive. And Contact was a motif of a collection that has been started under similar circumstances, I would say, in Vienna, and filled the other voids. That one that was blinded out after 89 because of the artistic scenes had something different in mind. It is a collection that's probably after the collection of Stenka, which is unbeatable, one of the most interesting collections of Eastern and Southern European arts that starts from the 60s as well and 70s, and tries to bring in that type of other narratives, yeah? Namely, it has a history, it has a strange history as well, because of it has been the benevolent, so to say, idea of a bank, an Austrian bank, that has very much been profiting of the opening up of the east and southeast of Europe, the Erste Bank, to do something, so to say, for the region, and to do something for them meant to harvest and collect maybe art. Yeah, but they had a good persons in the board, and this person said, well, let's try to follow not just an harvesting path like tape does. Yeah, you go research a region, buy it in, make an exhibition, and then you store it for the later, or let's not hide it in private collections as other banks do, but let's try to make a set of a collection that then can be used by others, and let's invite people to collect this that have had their histories in the respective regions. Jerzy Szewczyk, for instance, from Czech Republic, who had been, so to say, the one that communicated the Czech avant-garde in the 70s at home. Branka Stipancic, who together with Mladen Stilinovic has been so formative and important for finding out, actually writing the histories of the Yugoslav avant-garde, and a young Polish curator who was part of that enterprise that Gallery Foxhall Foundation, with that Gallery Foxhall Foundation managed, that suddenly the international art markets have been aware that there has been something like contemporary art, and there is something like contemporary art in Poland. Well, this collection is building up and filling, so to say, hopefully filling the same void. What we are seeing, I've been director of Vienna Fair last year, and that I never thought that I would do such a thing before. But I found, strangely enough, that there is not so many people willing still to do that, or deliberately trying to do something, what has been the slogan of the mid-1970s in Germany, to walk through the institutions of the enemy. So I thought, I remember that, why not walk through the institutions of the enemy and try to find out why this strict, so to say, borders that we had erected still in the late 1980s and early 90s in our practices around being not marketable, around a criticism of authorship and autonomy, why they have been so blurred in a lot of respects by the rise of the art markets that rose with the financial things. I have to say what I saw there as being collect models of collecting did not make me really hopeful that private collecting in the way that I tried to sketch it, or artist collecting and artist research that I tried to bring in, would make it into a broader idea of contemporary collecting. This is much more, that what we are seeing is much more the Basel model of a lifestyle interested urban elite around the continents that sees its representation no longer with the treasures of a nationalist historic past, like they would have done in the bourgeoisie of the 19th century, but of an internationalist, so to say, practice of contemporaneity, and the value exchange in between different collectors is much more in a competition than it is, it's much more competition than it is something like an interest in the practices of that what art still, as you have Stephen said, would have been done. On the other hand, I see as the state loses its power in the old model, whose decline as well you have described, there is a lot of private enterprises like foundations that take over. So the world is, the thing is blurred. The thing is blurred. It's no longer like in the 80s where the pension funds would buy collections and hide them from the public to evaluate them. But there is always something like a cultural air about this competition of showing, which I find of strange interest for an intervention. Thank you.
Thanks so much. There are two things that I just I can't help but notice. One is you mentioned kind of paramodernisms and the aggregated collections and non-instrumentalized collections on one hand, and then as we're going on, you also switched to the Generali Foundation and the Erste Bank as two private institutions. I mean, you mentioned one void and an aggregated collection model or type or current, and then the private institutions. That I found to be quite interesting in many senses. I mean, not to say that the Generali Foundation, comes with its own potential of being disbanded one day or the other. I mean, I think that's kind of because it became the canon. Yeah. Through the way it was, through the precision of the collection itself. Hence, it became a very tasty, complete, coherent collection for a huge institution somewhere in New York or whoever may afford it. So what happens there is kind of interesting in the sense that it becomes the canon. It fills the void in a particular way. It has the potential of being displaced fundamentally, no longer to be in Vienna, for example. And of course, the Erste Bank collection too. As private institutions, you never know what may happen in the future, which directions they may take, and then that may also be another displacement one day or the other. And so there's something very momentous, and at the moment it's fantastic, but tomorrow what would happen is always this kind of question that kind of hangs over us here too. With like running private institutions in Istanbul is kind of the same situation. It's just like you're always suspicious of putting together collections actually, because the responsibility is to the public fundamentally. And
but what is the who is formatting the public at this moment? You know, this is we would have to have a quite strong debate about the commons because of, well, there might be something like that what Arnold Gehlen had dreamt of conservatively, that there's a latency of institutions that would still be able, so to say, for a long time to keep like the European Museum of Contemporary Art, which is, by the way, a quite young institution, that might be able, so to say, to keep their idea of being a museum of the commons that would have a longer perspective to digest or display or educate around that what their collections have been. But if you look into the collections more deeply, you see that this has been always a very, very fragile thing. Yeah, they are rather hybrid aggregations of a certain milieu of collecting that has been politically around or with a director. So these collections as well are not that as we think objective as they are or whatsoever. What is objective is the institutionalized realm. The pseudo-objective is the institutionalized realm that surrounds it. Yeah, I'm very much looking forward to hear Jesus like them, because there is that idea of that could happen, that the museum is powerful enough to rewrite the canon and to, so to say, integrate a lot of other knowledges and leave them outside and alone, which I find a fantastic idea. But if you look into the histories of museums, it has been very few of them that really thought about or considered what they would do for the common. Yeah? So this seemingly short existence of a private collection, when it brings a thing to the point, yeah, then it helps the counter canon at least challenge a canon and fortify, is already an institutionalized living that I would say that these collections are having. Be they dispersed afterwards. What's really troublesome, for instance, in terms of Erste collection, what we always think, it has been a lot of friendship involved in the jury committee to bring all these things together. You know, I would not sell to a bank. People mistrusted to a bank. And it was an issue much more of friendship that allowed us to collect this in. And so we forced, so to say, the statutes of the bank to write that if, for whatever reason, this collection would not be longer in the bank, the first option is to donate or sell it to museums-like institution. And now it's so this was our, so to say, wish to and they followed it. So this will never be cut out and put on the market. I see that institutions likewise have that framing capacity and counter-framing capacity. What I really hope is that we all engage in a debate about the commons of the public institutions that might even allow us to engage in a debate about the common of the private institutions and the private collections. I found it very nice, this thing that we had yesterday, if it's not just a service instrument for private collectors, to open it up and have a small tour of entering this debate about the commons. What still stays is that most of the collections that we nowadays talk about being collections are just collecting art pieces.
Well, it would be interesting because, I mean, I don't want to drag this on any further, but there was maybe Mary Keller would think twice today why she gave postpartum document away. Maybe she would put a provision in her contract, maybe a provisional contract that would, that would ensure the commons of the, I mean, the future of the work. That maybe, for example, contractual protections are possible. All kinds of protections are possible. I think also, but they were, as you said, you were talking about friendship, but also the intimacy, and that's how these works were passing hands. They were not passing on to an institution, but they were passing through an intimate relationship with a very precise curator. They were almost being given to Sabina, or they were always given being to, you know. There's all of that psychology and kind of building trust behind all of those. But that trust is contingent upon processes and decision making that is completely outside that intimacy. And that's
totally. Yeah. But if you look at most of the contracts that are done at the moment into private collections, it is pure selling contracts, like objectivized selling contracts. So there's not even, so to say, a statute like Generali would have, or like Erste Collection, or like some corporate collections would have, that would ensure a certain level of commonality or openness, or that would engage at least in research documentation and publication. And so most of the private collections that we are seeing, for instance, building up in Eastern Europe, these huge, very rich collections, they harvest, and they harvest goods. Yeah, that's really warehouses, and it's just by chance that they sometimes, for the good or the bad, try to mimicry the system and install something like a collection curator and so on and so on. You saw how far this even goes if you think about the famous Ullens collection in Beijing with Chinese art. Yeah, the Belgians bring the Chinese art back and make a museum, yeah, and simulate a museum. But as soon as capital is out, the museum is not simulated any longer, and it's just again on the auction market, and even more, not just on the auction market, to go into other collections where common might be, but it's going into funds. Yeah? So there is a European model that we have to talk about. I think first of all we have to talk about this private collecting in terms of the commons. There is a European model, I think, that we have to talk about as well, which is a model that comes from the 19th century, which is the foundational association, the bürgerliche, the bourgeois society, that has to be readdressed because of its taking. If you look around to all the practices that we are mirroring in, it is foundations that are paying them. It's mainly not the states that are paying them. It's mainly not, so to say, the state institutions that support them. So there is already a parallel economy of financing that comes out of these benevolent bourgeois foundations, and I think we have to think about how to constitute that, and in a broader manner. And the debate will go on because of the state museums. Charles knows it, are dried out, and then there will be no difference in the end in the capacities. So sorry for being so woodcut and broad.
I'd quite like to prolong this discussion because I think it also relates to what we heard from Boisson and other people yesterday. So I'll start with a comment and then see if I can shape it into a question. But it seems to me that the possibility to rewrite the canon or to understand art history differently from the stories that we have coming out of the Enlightenment and extending through to '89, that's the urgency which is what we're responding to. In other words, that time of modernity no longer works. That question of universalism no longer is adequate for 7/10 of the world's population that are, as Steven said, no longer spectres, but actually real people who answer back. If we look at the model of how that canon was established, it was often private collections which began it.
That's what I tried to show.
But the moment, and this was very interesting, but the moment, and we even see that in Austria, it's the moment when those private collections in some way become public. And the post-Second World War method was the social democratic model of the state institution. But it's that moment, nevertheless, where the private becomes public, that the possibility of the canon being rewritten or being completely overturned exists. It seems to me, anyway, that this is the crucial moment. And in a sense, that's the moment where we are at now. If we look at Istanbul Modern, we look at Generali Foundation, we look at the kind of private museums which are being set up by collectors in Western Europe and in North America, they are not yet public in the sense that we might need it. And I don't want to go back to a social democratic model, but the question is, how do we, or how can we make that switch from the private interest and simply, if you like, the taste of the collector to something public? And collectors themselves maybe have a responsibility to do that. But also we, as the society which is interested in how democracy functions through art, or how art functions in relation to democracy, have a responsibility for doing that. And I'm not sure, I don't think the old models are sustainable. I don't think the question is simply that all these museums should then turn around and say to their city or their nation state, you should now fund us from now on. That's not going to work. But I'm not sure that we've really got a good model, and I don't know whether Generali really represents that kind of model or not, or Erste Bank represents that kind of model, or are they still in a process of transition? Do you see that transition as being possible, or how do you see it as being possible? Do you see it, first of all, do you see that as an issue? And secondly, how do you see it as being possible?
This is a very complicated and multifold question, Charles. I, for instance, don't think that the making public of the Pinot collection will shift the canons in the ways that we would like them.
Sorry, okay. I mean, just to clarify, I don't think that access is about being made public. In order to change, so simply opening the doors of a private collection and saying you can come in and have a look at it is not a gesture of publicness. That's the treasure chest model that we inherit from the Habsburgs and others. Yeah? So the question of, so maybe we need to define more clearly. I would say it's related to Steven's story of democratization, that's the moment where something becomes public. But maybe we really need to define what this making public is, because it's certainly not simply opening the doors, and it's not setting up Istanbul Modern as it's been set up now. Maybe it's closer to what was set up in Qatar because of this public-private collaboration, but that's still an old model, and I think we need to look to new ones.
Definitely, but it's a broad question that I would like to debate, and maybe we have time in the last panel. I think we are. It's the question of the moment, I think, because on the other hand, if we don't debate about the commons, yeah, and about how to address that type of knowledge production that is going on, we will be lost in strange, a bit late bourgeois ideas of the artist as the researcher and knowledge producer for himself, or the producer of other methodologies of knowledge production, as it is done in all of the development departments of the blue chip industry. Come on! So this is not the model that the academics, that the European academies, for instance, are so in favor is. It's just interesting, I think. If you would write that as paradactic or even parasitic structures into a debate of that what these collections meant, and that's a real interest. I mean, there are enterprises around that try to do that on the internet. Everybody was so fond of Ubunet because of that created almost, so to say, our own model or our own canon of the avant-garde film. I'm still very skeptical about that possibility because of it stays somehow so abstract and it's not rooted in a debate. It's not open to a debate. It's not, so to say, debatable, besides maybe some postings that we can do, that it's again now an exclusion machine of quite a range. You know, for instance, if you think about the curatorial research of young curators, that is net based. So there is still a lot of issues to publish, yeah, and to debate the published that we have to engage in. We usually use the internet just as a machine of friendship, maybe common ideas that mirror somewhere, and as a copy-paste instrument. But the broader idea of that, what this type of making public could be, has not yet been debated. I mean, there are some theoretical frames around that, how objects could speak by But and there is this idea of racière, but I'm not a real racialist, I have to say. But let's discuss that later. Thank you for your patience.
Okay. Yeah, maybe I will pose my question then later. But my question goes actually to Charles. Like, what do you, if you turn the question around, what do you expect the common to bring or to change? I mean, what is the expectation of what will happen?
What do you mean?
Well, it's very hard to formulate that. You want to open up something. You want this change to happen. But what is the expectation of this change?
I mean, I think it's in a way the model that I'm using is the construction of a new subjectivity in the late 18th, early 19th century, which we looked at through Caspar David Friedrich. I mean, there you see, and you know, as Steven said, it was contested. Yeah, it wasn't that this was, you know, suddenly everybody went, oh wow, that's who I am. Yeah, I'm this agent now being able to stand in front of a landscape and experience it. It was a contested process, but it was nevertheless a process which had enough currency in the wider context of democratization, in the wider context of industrialization, mechanicalization of modernity, all these factories being built and everything like that, to speak to an elite who felt themselves represented by those images in some way, or felt themselves enabled, you know, given agency, given capacity by those images. So I suppose that's what I'm looking for. I mean, in the sense I'm looking for, you know, I mean, I've said this before, but I think we're more in a pre-period. For the first time in my life, we're in a pre-period rather than a post-period. So we're no longer in post-modernity or post-structuralism or post-communism or post-human or whatever these posts were, yeah, that were from the 90s and the 2000s. I think we've entered a pre-period, and something like Occupy maybe represents some of those possibilities.
If you're in a pre-period, you might have your visions about the post already and this is what I'm asking for now. What is the vision of your post situation?
You mean after we've gone through the transition? What is the vision of the post? What do you mean? What are going to be the problems that we associate with building a new world? That's a tough one. No, that's projecting a couple of hundred years in advance.
You can provoke change without thinking or visualizing the post. Otherwise, where are you going?
No. I mean, I'm sure that's true in a way. I would think that it requires. Okay, it requires a global subjectivity, I think, in order to address the conditions that we might accept, which is something incredibly difficult. Democracy is based on the idea of demos. Yeah, it's not about majority rule, it's about rule of the people. That means all of the people. We have to start thinking about a global democracy. We have to start thinking about global citizenship. We have to start thinking about how that can be represented at the artistic level just as much as at the political level. That's the thing that Caspar David Friedrich achieved at a certain point. So how can we represent, what images can represent global subjectivity and be paralleled by a notion of global citizenship at the political level?
And how can we learn from the first universalist call that we tried to do that already in the 30s and 50s and 60s, yeah? That's the mission maybe of these practices that we have been debating now.
But I think, I mean, that's where my interest in this universalism from below is very important, because I think that those images of the 50s and 60s were always coming out of a particular geographic context.
For sure.
And you know, there were, I mean, somebody like Frantz Fanon is of course very important in trying to understand post-colonialism, but they were dealing with the consequences of colonialism. If we now say goodbye to post-colonialism, as an exhibition a few years ago in Guangzhou, which said called Farewell Post-Colonialism, once we say goodbye to that, I think we are trying to deal with a kind of global equivalence. I mean, it sounds very rough to say that in conditions of absolute Euro-American hegemony, but we see that you know, tiny little bits cracking off that. You know, we got 15% cut in our museum. I think that's a really good thing. We need to have less money if we're going to move to global. You know, we are far too rich, and we need to have 50% cuts, but we also need to try and do something with the 50% of the money that survives. There's nothing wrong with that. Yeah. But so I think in that process, we need to move we need to think about this global subjectivity in new ways, and the expressions of that in visual art forms, I'm looking for still. I mean, I think they're there sometimes, but I'm looking for them. Goran Đorđević is somebody I think who's incredibly important in that way, in that he in the way that he opens up that archive of modernity to another kind of interpretation. But he's as he says himself, he's the doorkeeper, the janitor. You know, he's opening the door on that transition moment, and we haven't yet stepped through the threshold. Sorry, that's really abstract, but
I completely understand where you are. I think it will take us to also rethinking paradigms of certain paradigms of ethics, because I think it starts there, right? So I talking about art and collections, but I think it's a far more broader transition that we're in. But anyway, that's another.
Ethics is the most complicated world in that process, I would say.
Sorry?
Ethics is the most complicated world that we can talk about these days. Now it's just a footnote. Yeah, that's why some people talk about truth.
Thank you, Georg. Thank you. Sorry, I just couldn't, stop the conversation. We're running up. We're running over time a bit, but it's really worth it. What we're going to do is Bartomeu will speak, and then after him, I'm not going to take any questions. We'll defer the questions to the afternoon and deal with it together with his after his presentation. Bartomeu Marí is. I just had to take off my glasses. Okay. He's currently the director of MACBA, Museum of Contemporary Art in Barcelona. He was the curator of exhibitions at the Foundation pour l'Architecture in Brussels between 1989 and 1993, and also a curator at IVAM between 1994 and 1996. Then he was the director of Witte de Wit between 1996 and 2002 in Rotterdam. From 2002 to 2004, he was a coordinator of the Centro Internacional de Cultura Contemporánea at San Sebastián at the Basque Country. In 2002, he co-curated the Taipei Biennial, and 2004 he co-curated the exhibition of Juan Muñoz in Madrid at Casa Encendida. In 2005, he was the curator of the Spanish Pavilion at the 51st Venice Biennial, where Antonio Muntadas was the invited artist. And between 2004 and 2008, he was the chief curator at MACBA Barcelona. He has curated many solo exhibitions by artists like Raoul Hausmann, Lars Wiener, Rita McBride, Picabia, and Marcel Grothars. He's written numerous articles about contemporary art, and he's now working on a new book. And today he's going to talk about the Internationale. Thank you, Bartomeu.
Thank you, Basif. Well, first, thank you very much to Salt and Vanaba for this invitation. It's a great pleasure to share the floor with such brilliant colleagues, speakers, and I'm going to try to stick to the timing, to which I'm going to be looking often to this machine. And I hope that I can contribute a little bit to the debates that are the subject of this symposium. I have been taking notes and rewriting my ideas as the speeches until now have been bringing other new layers of opinion and subjects in relation to what I had prepared before. First of all, as Vasif mentioned, a biographical note, it is true that I began my implication with contemporary art in a foundation for architecture in Brussels in 1989, and that, I think, the configuration of that institution really was the beginning of it all, and I feel that the more the time goes on, the more I drink and I eat from that experience. The Foundation for Architecture was a non-profit association, and it was connected with the another institution called the Archives d'Architecture Moderne, the Archives of Modern Architecture. And the archives were a museum without an exhibition room, without an exhibition space, and the foundation was an exhibition space without a collection. I spent 5 years in that institution, and one idea remained very important to me, and is the following. The Archives of Modern Architecture was, and probably is, the most important collection of architecture between the 1890s, so to say, and the 1960s or 70s, with a special interest in, it's probably the biggest and most complete library of publications of architecture between the two wars. The archives collected not only the most beautiful drawings, axonometries, watercolors that the architects until the 1950s and 60s did, but also collected the correspondence, the, how you call it, the accountability, the accounting, the bills, and all the papers relating to the economy of the constructions, so that you could research, you could, as a student, as a researcher, you could go through the entire history of architecture. And this is different from what most museums of architecture have done, which is to collect just the most beautiful drawings, and which is aesthetically very pleasurable, but scientifically not so useful. But let's focus on the subject of my intervention here, and that is MACBA as a study case. Excuse me. MACBA, and I have to give some biographical notes of the institution as well. MACBA opened its doors to the public in 1995, and is the result of the post-Olympics intention of constructing or investing in large national cultural institutions. When we say, or when I say national in this context, is Catalan national. And MACBA stands for the National Museum of Contemporary Art, which you see in the building here, most of you know it, designed by Richard Meyer in a very intrinsic, modern gesture. The building stands alone without any physical or aesthetic relation to its environment. This year, 2012, we celebrate the 25th anniversary of the MACBA Foundation. I will explain what the MACBA Foundation is, because the museum is a consortium that brings together the City Council of Barcelona, the Catalan government, the MACBA Foundation, which is a private entity bringing together companies and individuals that, to cut a long story short, just give money for the acquiring works of art for the collection. And in 2007, the Spanish Ministry of Culture also joined the consortium MACBA. That means I have 4 bosses in my boardroom, and I have to account to all 4 of them. Until now, they were all politically balanced, meaning there was more or less progressive and liberal, conservative in more or less 50% shares. The MACBA Foundation standing in the middle as an arbiter, as a moderator, so to say. But right now, there are the 3 different political or public powers all went liberal, liberal conservative, with the only difference of being either Spanish nationalist or Catalan nationalist. That's the only thing that separates those 3 bodies. One element that is important to understand the dynamics of the collection is that MACBA, consortium MACBA in itself does not own nearly any work of art. We are the custodians of works of art which are owned by different entities, meaning the City Council of Barcelona owns part of the collection, the Catalan government owns part of the collection, the MACBA Foundation owns part of the collection. The Ministry of Culture owns a huge collection, which is mainly in Madrid, at Reina Sofia, but and later I will mention the relationship to that also in terms of collecting. And so therefore what could be seen as a weakness for MACBA in the past, I have tried to transform it in a strength. So in a way, MACBA is not a museum about possessing, or our strategies are not about possessing, they are about sharing. And we do use works of art, we do not rent them. We tried to borrow works from the collection of the National Museum of Modern Art in Paris, Pompidou Center, and they asked us to pay a fee, a rental fee, and we said they could keep their work for that fee. And that is something we could discuss later on. It's nothing against my friends of the Pompidou Center, but I think it is we're entering a moment of deep paranoia, which for which artworks, even owned by public entities, and this is another issue that Charles brought earlier, are being used as capital assets. Turning an apparent weakness into strength meant to turn the sock inside out, or the glove inside out, if you want a more elegant image. And so therefore we started, I realized that there were incredibly rich bodies of heritage, extraordinarily important, around us in Barcelona that were not being used in any museographical way. This is the facade, for those who don't know, of the documentation center at MACBA. I'll try to speak later on. I hope I don't forget to speak a little bit about that, but paradoxically, we are in a we are actually in a incredibly big paradox of being in the process of shrinking, and at the same time we are expanding. I'll try to explain what that means, with the hope that I have understood myself the situation we find in the present. So, what is around us that we don't possess, but that we can use in order to activate some narratives that are important for our existence as a museum? We have the National Museum of Catalan Art, which is now more or less the Tate Gallery, Catalan art from the 12th century until right now the early 20th century. From now onwards, we're discussing with the director of the museum to extend their activity until the present. We have the Architects Association, we have the Archives of the City of Barcelona, we have the National Archives, again, Catalan National Archives, we have the National Library, we have something a bit strange, the Housing Board. The Housing Board owns an extraordinary collection of photography that documents the history of housing in the city from the early 20th century until today. And we are also collaborating, as I said before, we are exchanging items with all of these institutions. We are also exchanging items with the Reina Sofia Museum as per next month when we're opening, or in a couple of weeks when we're opening a new exhibition. We do have a special deal as well with the La Caixa Foundation, which allows us to have access to their collection. Some in our surroundings have interpreted that association as if we had sold our souls to the devil, like if we had married we had really compromised our principles. And I think it is one of the most interesting moves that we have done in order to incorporate a number or a large segment of works that to which we didn't have access and we couldn't afford to buy. But also, this is a project for the future. We have coordinated and we have oriented their acquisitions within a single intention. So we don't have a collection, we have many collections. And we do have a special treatment for putting those heritages, those collections at the service of specific narratives. I think it is important to mention that, in my opinion, the problem is not to rewrite the canon. The problem or the question is to make different narratives coexist and live together at the same time. I think if we are about taking one canon out and putting another canon in, then I'm not so interested in joining the dance. It's not possible to pretend that one single canon is going to function for a diversity of contexts and a diversity of narratives. I'd like to show some steps of how do we deal with this idea of collecting, and what do I understand by narratives. Before that, I want to mention that half of my PowerPoint disappeared about 2 hours ago when I tried to combine it with the other half. I think I have too many images anyway. We're going to pass very quickly, maybe too quickly, and as I said, I want to be strict with timing, and which I think I still have like 30 minutes. I'm going to first talk about what you're not going to see, and that is a presentation that focused on 1958 as the moment in which there is a big shift in the Spanish history, contemporary history, so to say, because the several events then on the one hand make Spain go out of the outer sea of the post-war and the Franco period, and on the other hand it creates a classicism of our contemporary culture. That classicism is informalist painting, abstract material painting, represented exponentially by Antoni Tapies, but that it has a correspondence with the 1958 Biennale, Latino American Biennale, where the collection of MoMA, with paintings by Achille Gorky, by Robert Motherwell, by Philip Gaston, Franz Klein, Maurice Lewis, or Frank Stella, was exhibited in Barcelona, 1958. That meant that Franco regime did no longer look with bad eyes to abstract painting, but assumed abstraction as their international language. 1958, the United States acknowledged or helped Spain to be recognized by the United Nations, UNO. In exchange, Spain also gives land to the United States to build the military bases. There are 3 important military bases still today. As a payback, the United States gives the Fulbright scholarships to a number of technicians, especially economists, to study in the United States. When they come back to Spain in the early 60s, they start transforming the economy of Spain from an autarkic country to a liberal capitalist country, and the rest, we know it. I'm not going to tell it all, but that is the moment of the big shift. Franco and Spain is no longer seen as a fascist country. It is still seen as a dictatorship, but Franco's anti-communism makes that Spain is accepted into the world of the winners. Before that, Spain was in the world of the losers. Quickly go to the collection, otherwise I'm going to spend my time talking about what you don't see. Where do we go? As I said, our intention in building a collection is building narratives, telling stories that make sense, and is not about accumulating objects, but about spreading ideas. This cost me some very expensive moments with my board, but I am convinced that this is the way to go. You will see not many masterpieces by very well-known artists from here on. Mostly the names of the artists won't tell you much or probably anything, and we'd rather be also, as a consequence of the heavy crisis through which Spain is going through already since 2009. I was appointed director in 2008, and I have the unlikely privilege of having seen my budget shrink and be reduced drastically, so that's not a very happy story. But we believe these narratives are even much more interesting than accumulating new objects. Modern and present are not nouns but adjectives, and the interrogation of this presentation was to see how do we explain the consolidation of the modern aesthetics in a chronology that doesn't match any canon. And we are in late 50s. This is the this is the epigone of surrealism. A group called Dau al Set, Dice to the Seven, really was bringing the last breath of surrealist imagery into a very dark cultural situation of that was the Barcelona of that time. On the right hand side, we see a painting by Tapies, Cuixart, and Joan Pons. The post-surrealist or the surrealist epigone give birth very quickly to, or not very quickly, but it's transformed into the abstract painting, abstract materic painting that constitutes our classicism, and we see some international references like Dubuffet or Lucio Fontana next to, again on the right, half cut by a bad cropping of the photograph, another Tapies painting that moves slowly from that post-surrealist to the materic abstraction. And then very quickly we move to, in the late 50s, to a paradoxical or apparently contradictory conjunction of aesthetics. We're looking at architecture, photographs, and documentation on a very important house built by Georg, a member of Team 10, probably the first architect after the war that opens his practice to the international discussions on architecture, especially on the criticism of the dogmas of the modern movement. And this house is a private house that breaks completely with the canonic rules of the modern composition, that is the 90-degree angle. There is no 90-degree angle in the entire house. This is 1954 is the project, and it was finished in 1958. Also, very much connected to the aesthetics that Oteiza brought into sculpture. Oteiza is the grandson of constructivist sculpture, a Basque artist that is very important in the renewal of or the consolidation of those aesthetics. And after 58, when the regime acknowledges that abstraction is a language that can be used in the promotion of Spain, they bring Oteiza in 1959 to the Sao Paulo Biennial, where he gets a big award. Oteiza is going to become the father as well to the old school of Basque artists until Ibon Aranberri or Jon Mikel Euba, as we know it. But what does post-surrealism imagery or the image of abstract painting has to do with rational or rationalist architecture? This is an apartment building still in the center of Barcelona, near the Barceloneta beach, that you can see if you go to the harbor. Again, no 90-degree angle is used in this composition, and I'm doing a very formalist but very simple and straightforward reading of this material because of time. So I asked for excuses in advance for my simplification. Some examples of this informalist and abstract metallic dark palette painting at the end of the space, again Tapias and Millares paintings. These aesthetics that really conform what we can call the classicism as in Spanish contemporary art. This classicism that is also contrasted in the late 50s by a figure like Cumella, a sculptor who is known by his pottery, but that gains a tremendous international recognition also in the early 50s, and I'm going to show you why later on. The image of the reality in which the country is at that time, we're speaking about the mid-50s, is brought by the photographers of the time, who were very influenced by the neo-realist currents of that come from Italy at the moment, and again live together with this completely invented reality of the painting and this obsession with rationalism of the architects. You could imagine that this would bring to complete fight to complete disgregation by opposing these different aesthetics. In our context, they live together very well. I'm going to run quickly through these images that which just add different views to works that have been seen. On your right, documentation on the group R. And the group R is from the architecture and design world, the entity that popularizes the modern aesthetics in design and a little bit in architecture. I wanted to say that the key, the cross element for this presentation of the collection, for most of the presentations that we're doing since 2009, takes the consideration that the consolidation of modern aesthetics in our context takes place in the 50s, not in the 20s, and that this consolidation cannot separate art from the practices of architecture and design. And I would add literature. The literary experience is crucial to understand our contribution to the modern. Even if the graphics here are still quite obsolete for the time, in terms of design and architecture, these people really change or make the visual context, the visual landscape of our surroundings change. And this, again, we are talking about the mid-50s to the early 60s. This is a very important group of documents. I showed you before the documentation center from MACBA, and even if those materials come from the partly from the center, partly from the architect association, and partly from the family of the architect, these are images of the 1951 Triennale di Milano. This is the Spanish pavilion, and you can barely see, but you can imagine that. Well, this was designed by Koderk, again, the same architect of the house. And we see two views of the pavilion where you can see that the curator is combining works by modern artists like Miró. There were photographs of Gaudí. There were wooden sculptures from the Middle Ages, from the Romanesque, from the Roman period. And there was a selection of objects made or coming from traditional craftsmanship, like hats, like bottles, like fabrics. It was, and there is a little bit in the vitrine, there is the history and images of the pavilion, because this was also the first time Spain was represented in an international context after the Spanish War, which happened between 36 and 39, and many consider just a preface to the Second World War. But until 1951, the country didn't exist or didn't have any representation in cultural terms. Representing our modernity from Miró and Comella, which is where he got a golden medal, to the Romanesque, to Gaudí, but to popular craftsmanship as well, is going to be a very daring and a radical curatorial gesture, if we can use words of our time, in order to represent a country, which is something that we nowadays we doubt is possible, but at that moment it's still possible. These are also examples of that presentation, and we move to another designer of the 1957-58, where he's integrating already the compositional techniques of the post-war. I mean, his name is Joan Pedragosa, and he had been influenced by the school of Ulm, as the previous design was still had not integrated the typesetting compositions of the avant-garde. Pedragosa is giving all these aesthetics to the publicity and advertising of the time. These are just shots of the collections showing especially the work of Joan Brossa and Josep Maria Mestres Quadreny, our John Cage, if I can also cut a long story short, experimental musician that used the idea of the city plan, of the urban structure, as a method to compose music. So it was the inhabitant, or more to say, the people walking in the street who could interpret and determine the execution of music. And this was to be played also by an orchestra. We're going to speed up our journey through the collection, as I have like 15 minutes left and a million ideas to tell, from the perspective of visual poetry, as I have jumped pretty much, as the images are not so good and not so telling, I have skipped the figure of Joan Brossa, visual poet that begins with double set, and is very important to understand our Catalan contemporary art until today. Actually, this is the subject of a presentation of the collection that we will do next year. But Brossa makes us connect with other artists that have been playing with the use of language and the use of game and the use and the element of pleasure and the play. Actually, is the good notion, like Øyvind Falstrom that you see at the end of the room, and of Constant that you see, nearly don't see because the sculpture is transparent. This was Joan Brossa, as I left behind, but we go, yes, we jump. I think I'm going to speed up a little bit now. Constant Nieuwenhuis is the Dutch, one of the main Dutch contributors to the International Situationist, but he is a painter from Cobra that for many years of his life, from 1956 to 1974, he devoted his life to the imagination of New Babylon, which is a new way to make a city, a new way to live, a new world, and a new set of relations. We could acquire this 1956 piece very in 2008 already. And Øyvind Falstrom is the great artist, and you could I do link him with the tradition of visual poetry because some of his work has to do with that. We do at the museum host the Øyvind Falstrom Foundation, so we have the estate of the foundation in our collections. I forgot to mention that beyond those collections that we have outside of the museum, inside the museum in the past years, we have received either donations, promised gifts of long-term loans of the entire archives of Joan Brossa, by the way, a very large collection of art and language works and documents by a French young collector, a really fantastic person. We do have, we're going to show in 2 weeks' time, a promised gift of more than 50 works and documents from Gordon Matta Clark that a Chilean Catalan collector is giving us. We have also received the entire state and archives of Xavier Miseracs. Again, the name won't tell much, but he's one of the most important photographers of the city of Barcelona and surroundings from the 1950s to the 1980s, etc. From Fahlstrom, we're going to move, and the idea of play, pleasure, and combination, we're going to move to the area of where we try to represent. Well, this is again this same room looking at the back. This is the constant work that I mentioned before. It is 1956 construction belonging to the New Babylon series, and this is a reminder of what used to be the 1959 Museum of Contemporary Art of Barcelona. There was a private MACBA that existed for a year and a half, and that we do not have anything to do with that project, but we like to recall that our history is, we don't come out of the blue. We're actually, and I skipped another vitrine where there was another part of this story being told. Already in the 50s, the civil society, meaning the local bourgeoisie, invented activities that were precedents to what we do now. This is a piece by Xavi Salaverria, a young Basque artist who made this work inspired, or actually playing with the different pedestals that Oteiza used in 1959 for the presentation of his works at the Sao Paulo Biennial. Okay, those are the different pedestals which were designed by Oteiza, and of course this is a replica, but he put them one inside the other in a work titled Collapse. I think it's very important to understand as well that we only begin now, or only artists of his generation, he must be in his early 30s, are beginning to consider the origins and the genealogy of our modernity. Next, ambience was tried to deal with the break that in the 70s, the artists of a younger generation tried to play in relationship to the informalist painting of the 50s and 60s that had created a dominant aesthetic ambience. I wouldn't say an aesthetic canon, there was no canon, but if you talk to most people about in Spain today about what is contemporary art, they will identify it with abstract painting. In the 70s, you all know what happens in the world. In the Spanish context, what happens is that artists like Toni Llena on the far right, reading what Arte Povera, what the innovations and new languages of artists such as Robert Rauschenberg, which again I think I have a better picture of this composite work from 1971. Llena was painting with talc powder, was doing work with sweat, with saliva, with sperm, and with broken papers. It's really our version of Arte Povera that moved rather quickly into the political implications. There is I hope I can get to the room where the political side is expressed very quickly here. We acknowledge the relevance of the schools of design on the vitrine, which were the embryo from where the artists of that generation, and again I'm talking about the late 60s, come from. There was no art school, but these guys came out of design schools. The Encuentros de Pamplona, the 1972 documental-like event in Pamplona was very important. Again, works related to another view of the room, Fina Miralles, Also 1968, a land art type of intervention, ephemeral intervention in the nature. And in the first row, Francesc Torres, when the artist wanted to be a designer, an industrial designer, and do works that could be sold for very, very little price for everyone, this idea of democratizing art. Now, I'm gonna stop 1 minute here, is the project Walden of 1974, built by Ricardo Bofill. Ricardo Bofill is known by being one of the main names of postmodernist, neoclassical architecture. But in the late 60s, early 70s, Bofill was under the influence of Jonas Friedman and the megastructure movement. He was also under the influence of Constant, as he told me, and the New Babylon project, as he told me in an interview. And Walden too was a macro structure that had to produce a new type of society. You know, we are again on this idea that architecture has to change the way people behave. And we included this project here because it is the end of the belief in the modern. This really collapses the belief that architecture, the modern project in architecture, is valid, and it has to go beyond. It is very much rooted also to the French post-megastructure generation of Claude Parent, for instance, or Virilio, which at the time was at his office. These are late 60s Bofill. And again, we speed up to go to a room where we combined another idea we gained from the crisis of the modern. I had to include the figure of Friedrich Kiesler. Friedrich Kiesler is, as you all know, his work is in the hands of the Kiesler Foundation in Vienna, with whom we also made an agreement of a common exchange. So we not only can work with collections around us, but also with other archives which are far away from us. But it was important to bring Kiesler in the idea of the break of the modern space in architecture, the end of modernism, and the beginning of something else that artists like Pablo Palazuelo, Gego, the sculpture Gego, you barely see her sculpture, like lines floating in the space, and on the end, at the end of the room, the paintings of Pic Adrian, a Romanian-born artist who lives in Barcelona since the late, came to Barcelona trying to escape the war, but he liked it so much that he stayed, and since there was no war in Spain, he continued living there. This is our minimalism, so to say. This is also very early 60s. Very quickly, the work of Armando Andrade Tudela, who in fact acknowledges a great influence from Kiesler in his way to represent space and the idea of tissue and the idea of web. Again, Andrade Tudela has a lot to do with the idea of craftsmanship, which is something that, with the idea of the rural, is very important to understand our contribution to modernity, even if Andrade Tudela is Peruvian. As I said, the work of Pablo Palazuelo, classical modern painter, also from the 50s, who does not belong to this category of abstract material gestual painting, but much more rationalist. And the last room, and I think my images end here, so I think I have some 5 minutes for conclusion. Yes, I do have, I think, with the indulgence of Vasif. We dedicate the last room to the analysis of the pop culture. My feeling is that my position is that what was called for many years Catalan conceptual art, it is in fact a combination of other perspectives that have absolutely nothing to do with conceptual art, but to begin with pop. These are works, we're seeing works, photographic works by Nigel Henderson, one of the founders of the independent group, but very, very disappeared. Actually, Vicente Todoli, who is in my acquisition board, acknowledged that he wanted to make Tate by these works. These are photographic works from the late 60s, and no one at Tate was interested in Nigel Henderson. And I think it's a very interesting figure that has gone very unnoticed under the shadow of Richard Hamilton or other most famous and successful artists. This is Eduardo Paolozzi, an edition from 1966, kind of very psychedelic version of pop, and this is the other Nigel Henderson photographic researches which become abstract paintings. I could show this next to Tapia's next time, which could correspond also chronologically. And Richard Hamilton, our very dear Richard Hamilton, who died last year, brings us also to the presence of pop culture in the form of the Aspen magazine of the time. Okay, very quickly to the politically engaged section. At the end, you see the work of Raimundo Patiño, a Galician artist who used the Galician language in 1968, being Galician very completely prohibited to use in public. But it describes in this comic-like work a conspiration between the Vatican and CIA to kill the last person who spoke Galician. And the work of Grup de Treball, this work has been exhibited in the Moderna Galleria Ljubljana recently, is together with the work of Leon Ferrari about the tortures and the disappeared people under the Argentinian dictatorship. Again, the Grup de Treball, this is a study on the illegal press under Franco times, which was shown in the Paris Biennial of 1974. I think I may be wrong by 1 year. The work of Marcel Brotars is also relevant in this context about the crisis of the museum, and to finish with the work of Jon Mikkel Euba, as I mentioned before. So, to finish with, I would like to say something about what is the future of this collection. In the way, as I see it, as far as I can work with it, as I said, more than increasing the number of objects in this collection, which by now, if we count what is inside the museum plus the relationship with the La Caixa collection, it goes around the 6,000 items. More than number of items, I want to focus on the potential and the capacities to generate narrations, to generate presentations, and to generate visions of how the past helps to imagine the future. Zdenkas mentioned yesterday that it was important to be in equal position to imagine the future. And I think this is what we try to do, or what the museum is for. I think it's a machine, if one can be utilitarian, to imagine the future, because the present is already very, very complex to understand. However, the way we represent the past will not change it, but will help us jump into the future. And I think the turn of the century, from the 20th to the 21st century, is where the MACBA collection is more relevant. We started also commissioning. Henri Sala and Sheila Kamerit's last project is is one of our recent acquisitions, and we have also begun to commission and execute projects as extramuros of the museum. But probably the rest could be discussed in the questions that can be asked later on.